Hello, I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Center for Free Expression. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University and this event's co-sponsors, the Ryerson School of Performance, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library, I want to welcome you to the second in the Center for Free Expression's In Conversation series, featuring prominent guests discussing issues important in the current political moment, in which democracy is under threat, public discourse in vital matters is fragmented into self-affirming ideological bubbles when not discouraged altogether, and censorship is increasingly seen as an ally rather than an impediment to social justice. Today's conversation is with one of the most interesting and creative Shakespearean directors in the world, Iqbal Khan. This distinguished British theater director, who has had productions of Othello, Tartuffe, Antony and Cleopatra, amongst others, with the Royal Shakespeare Company at Stratford-upon-Avon, along with productions at Shakespeare's Globe in London, at the National Theatre, at theaters in the West End, and with Box Clever, a remarkable writer-led theater company dedicated to the creation of contemporary theater for young people, as well as productions in theaters and opera elsewhere in Britain, in Paris, Japan, and the United States. Iqbal has worked extensively in drama schools in the UK, has had residencies and delivered lectures at various American universities, and most recently was the Michael Douglas Visiting Artist at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Iqbal's unique life experience has brought him to a place where he represents the nexus of what we're trying to explore with these Center for Free Expression conversations. Welcome, Iqbal.
Thank you, Jim.
The title for today's discussion is Shakespeare, a playwright for our polarized times. Is Shakespeare an icon to be toppled or a playwright whose work still matters? We are delighted that Iqbal will be in conversation with Carolyn Sale, who is an associate professor of English at the University of Alberta, where she teaches courses in Shakespeare and other early modern writers, and is herself a public intellectual who engages such issues in the university and beyond. Welcome, Carolyn. After about 45 minutes of conversation with Iqbal, Carolyn will turn to the audience to bring you into the discussion. As you listen, if you have questions at any point you would like addressed when we turn to the audience, please click on the Q&A tab that you'll see at the bottom of your screen and write down your question as you think of it. Don't wait till the very end. And then we'll have time to discuss those as we move on with the program. So now it's time to hear from our guests. Over to you.
Well, first, I want to say what an honor and a pleasure it is, Iqbal, to have the opportunity for this conversation with you today. And I know we will have many eager listeners to everything that you have to say. The question before us is how Shakespeare's writing for the stage may continue to make him a playwright for our polarized times. And I thought I would just say a few words to set us up for that conversation. Yeah. The polarization of contemporary cultures, contemporary Anglo-American cultures at any rate, pales, right? I rush to add in relation to the polarization of England for a good part of the 16th century, which during the Reformation witnessed so much bloodshed in the name of religion. But our times are certainly fractious, and we are witnessing the pulling down of iconic figures of the past as the present judges them as being on the wrong side of one or another political issue. Here in Canada in late August, for example, a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, Prime Minister for a significant part of the late 19th century, was pulled down in Montreal for Macdonald's role in creating the residential school system and implementation of policies under which famine and disease forced some First Nation communities to leave their traditional territories. The premier of the province in which I reside, who appears to model his political conduct on Trump's, responded with a dog whistle to his base by calling flamboyantly for the statue to be transported to Edmonton so that it might be erected on the legislature grounds here. Now that didn't happen and hopefully won't happen, but Shakespeare is not immune to this kind of contest, right, over historical figures in a moment in which so many are working to promote social values that would make our cultures more just. There have and will continue to be controversies over whether or to what degree Shakespeare's work ought to be taught in high school curricula. And we are seeing political denunciations of Shakespeare, or rather denunciations of the continuing use of his work. In a recent blog for the theater site Howl Round, for example, theater practitioner Carolyn Sale declared the Shakespeare system as oppressive, meaning by the Shakespeare system the full range of academic and theatrical institutions and practices that work to promote continuing valorization of his work, a system that she declared to be that of white supremacy. I think it's fair to say that Shakespeare professors have their own concerns, especially about, for example, The Merchant of Venice, especially in light of tragic events such as the shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which occurred 2 years and 1 day ago. The concern, of course, is in the light of the continuing anti-Semitism of contemporary cultures. Does the representation of anti-Semitism in Merchant render the play unteachable or unperformable? Is the risk of performing such a play simply too great in our polarized times? Might it simply feed ethnic hatred, especially in a context such as Donald Trump's America, which will hopefully soon be brought to an end, where the person of the greatest authority actively stokes hatred of more than one kind? On the other hand, in a recent essay collection, Teaching Social Justice Through Shakespeare, Kim Hall, a professor of Shakespeare at Columbia, described Shakespeare's role in a racial uplift project in early 20th century America as testifying to the ways in which Shakespeare's work has and should continue to serve, in her phrasing, as a common ground for learning new forms of cooperation between different racial communities, especially, as well as contributing to the project of decolonizing the Shakespeare classroom. To study Shakespeare, Hall writes, is to study power, the power of the state, the power of the mob, the power of institutions. To use Shakespeare as a means of collective effort is to give students the tools for intelligently organized resistance in all phases of life. Shakespeare, she continues, has much to teach about regime change, the manipulation of language for personal, erotic, and political ends, and social power on all registers. Your work as a director involves the challenges, right, of thinking through all of that, right, as you aim to stage the plays and productions, right, that make them of continuing relevance. And there is so much for us to talk about in relation to your work, including your magnificent Othello. But the big questions here are, I think, these. What do you think Shakespeare's plays in performance can bring to our polarized times? And more particularly, what do you feel you can accomplish as a director, or have already accomplished, right, as a director of Shakespeare, to make his work, right, of continuing relevance, and perhaps even to help us deal with the problem of polarized cultures or polarized approaches to some of our most vexed social problems, right? A big question, and let's see where you would like to go with it.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Caroline. Right, I was making a lot of notes there as you were setting the context for our conversation, and I suppose the best place to start, perhaps for me, would be Kim Hall's framing of our engagement with his work as being an opportunity to seek that common ground for new forms of cooperation. I love that, and an interrogation of systems of power. It seems to me that those two things are incredibly important now. I mean, the one is a critique, and the other is a kind of more generative sense of what are the new ways that we can engage with each other. And it seems to me that Shakespeare's plays do this all in every single play. He's engaging with these questions, and he's engaging with them not in an angry way, not in a kind of in a slab-like take your medicine sort of way. He has enormous delight. There is enormous surprise in the way that he deals with topics, and he also, perhaps uniquely for that time, deals with every bit of society, even though a lot of the lead characters, as it were, are often kings and queens and princes and all the rest of it, leaders of countries. But there are always important textures of the story that deal with the other bits of society, and for me, that's always rewarding, because I'm always, when I'm engaging with these plays, trying to convey a story about the whole of mankind, not just the exemplary figures. And he does this in a multitude of ways. So I think where I begin with all of these plays, and where I've always begun with these plays, is to ask the radical question, which is, why should anyone give a shit about this playwright who wrote these things 450 years ago, and is synonymous with a kind of colonial project that has left vast parts of the world oppressed and subjugated? Why should we still continue to care? Should he still be in the vanguard of our explorations, etc.? And I would say yes, but I don't take that in complacently. Whenever I begin these plays, I have the knowledge I have of performance history and my research, but I start again, and I try and discover what is my primitive response to the material. I do this all the time when I engage with these plays with young people, and I often will rehearse or examine a play with young people, again, who have no reason to use him to make sense of their lives. Often they're being taught to use him to basically instrumentally to get grades, to move through high school or whatever, and what they don't often get is Shakespearean performance. They don't get embodied ideas. They don't get the electric pulse of these plays in action. But I listen always when I begin, and I listen to what I think the plays might say significantly about the world now. So, for instance, I mean, if I'm doing a play like Antony and Cleopatra, whatever that the commentaries might have said, I start again, and I try and understand why I'm interested in it now, why anybody would be interested in it now. And central to that play, I discovered when I was working on it, is this contest over the center of the world. Should it be situated in the East or in the West? Which is a profoundly provocative question. Of course, there's this wonderful, glamorous relationship between these two mature individuals that run these various domains, the Antony, Rome, and Cleopatra, the East, Egypt. But the generative motor of that play is not a love story. It's a contest over the political center of the world. Right. And it's for me, discovering things like that really generate my interest in these things, and direct my gaze and my passion for them. Is that a good beginning?
Yes, it is. Antony and Cleopatra is also a contest of whether a woman can define what is the center of the world. We might throw into.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what I found really interesting about that play was, I mean, how much presence she has, how much space she takes in the first half of the play, and then her silence as post her departure, as it were, post their losing the battle. Her subsequent silence is very, very interesting. And it is, as you say, ultimately her her right to decide for herself her place in the world is constrained. And that's dramatized very, very interestingly. And yeah, completely. I mean, I think there is an issue about Shakespeare to do with the sorts of women he writes, and the restricted interiority that he gives women generally in his plays. There are exceptions, but I mean, I think that's absolutely relevant now.
Could we maybe think, because I want to make sure we give plenty of time, as I say, to your magnificent Othello for the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Yes.
So we want to make sure we range across your work, right? From like the big theater, for the big theater companies, but also through to your work for Box Clever, right? As that everyone has a really clear sense of its range. But I do think, yes, your Othello is just such a wonderful place for us to start, right? Given that, you know, what you've said already, that, you know, all of these plays, if they're doing the work that you feel Shakespeare wanted them to do, they're always showing us the other side, right? So they're also contests over narrative between characters battling for control. And this, of course, then becomes complicated in relation to matters of race and matters of gender. And I wonder if we could maybe just start thinking about your wonderful Othello and what you felt you were aiming to accomplish with it.
Yeah, well, I've done a couple of productions of Othello, and I played Othello myself in twice. So I've had a long history with that play, and actually I remember watching it when I was very, very young, and recording it into a tape recorder when I was 10 years old. So it's always operated on me emotionally and viscerally. But my feelings about it have evolved enormously over time. There was a time when I was incredibly impressed by Olivier's presentation, performance, as it were, and have now find it, of course, incredibly problematic. And I think when I was given the opportunity to revisit it at the RSC in 2015, I did what I always do, which is ask myself what my relationship is now, and sort of wanted to ignore, because I find the performance history of this play in particular has I found that the performance history has profoundly distorted our engagement with the play.
Okay.
The humiliation that's enacted on the actors playing Othello throughout the ages, I think, has been extreme, because Iago is often given license to range free and to pull strings, and for that to be the case, our Othello has to be presented as having, you know, a minimal IQ, as it were. You know, he has to have a limited IQ. And for me, as I read the play again now, I see it as the interrogation of the limits of the rational mind. How much, once our faith is dislodged, how easy is it for us to have any sense of the truth of a thing through rational processes alone? Is there any ocular proof that can recover the faith that we had? That's terrifying. And the questions of race are significant. Obviously, they're embedded in the piece, but they're often treated in a black and white sense, that it's literally a black and white world, and that might very well be what Shakespeare intended. But in doing the play now, and in using it to speak about the world now, I wanted to question this sort of the accepted wisdom that we have, that Iago is basically a proto-fascist. He's a white supremacist, and delights in the destruction of this black man. Because what I found in it was that Iago professes a lot of potential truths. There's a very complicated and contradictory psychosis at work there. What he does, though, unequivocally, is provoke racial hatred in others. Or provoke the expression of racial hatred in others. What motivates him is a slipperier thing, and I wanted to sort of, so I asked myself the question about the potential race of Iago, and I imagined how the DNA of the play might shift if actually Iago himself was a person of color in some way. And it changed for me completely how we engage with not just a narrative, which then becomes a narrative not just about racial hatred, but also, more importantly, I think, a narrative about a series of different kinds of betrayals. Political betrayals, personal betrayals, the betrayals between two men who potentially share a kind of heritage, but have engaged with the dominant country in different ways. One's assimilated and one hasn't. Othello then becomes somebody like a Lenny Kravitz, the kind of, the superstar other that's given enormous license, and Othello potentially is the assimilated, very skillfully assimilated person of color who can, and this form for me is very interesting, is that who can, in the world at the moment, with what might be defined as kind of, white fragility, that he can exploit fragility or anxiety around race and language. He can tell a racist joke, and if he encourages people to laugh in a room, they'll laugh with him until he silences them. If he stops laughing, the room will be paralyzed by his response to. So he can liberate a certain kind of ugly narrative, a legacy that exists. So my Venice wasn't totally white. The executive was still white, because that for me still is a relatively clear picture of the world as it is. But it was a bit more mixed up, as it were, lower down in the world. And his engagement with those different hierarchies in the society allowed me to tell lots of different kinds of narratives about otherness, and, as I say, to explore different kinds of betrayals. So what I did was I had this provocation. And I asked the RSC to allow me a week workshopping with both a black and a white Iago. And I rehearsed the scenes as much as I could in exactly the same way. And did other things, also explored the way I might use torture in the piece, because Othello is the leader of a mercenary band. In the modern context, that's potentially the black ops operations that exist that are not visible. That is the chaos that exists in Othello's mind, as it were. So to explore these two strands in the piece, because I understood that the provocation I was suggesting, the RSC would allow, but would be very nervous about. So for me, it was as much an opportunity to show them, as well as persuade myself, that the DNA of the play remained, that the charge of the play still remained, that I wasn't in an unuseful way distorting the play, that it was still Shakespeare's play, but that we were able to kind of refresh our engagement with it. And that's what I found at the end. When we shared the work, actually the producers and the artistic directors were there, and when asked for a response, they were very nervous about giving a response immediately. And brilliantly, it was the white actor who played Iago who said, well, I don't have a problem with this. And the minute he gave them permission to talk to this, everybody was suddenly free to kind of express their opinion. And for me, this is a very interesting thing, because the ability for people to be given license to utter inconvenient truths is very, very important in a rehearsal room. And it's one of the things that I'm very keen to do, is to my rooms are often populated by people with widely ranging backgrounds and heritages, and also very different senses of ownership of the material that we're dealing with. And so one of the things I have to do and engage in is how do I give everyone the authority to utter whatever they want to utter. And that's not just the people of color, maybe, who haven't been used to being in these exalted places, as it were, quotes.
Yes.
but it's also the people maybe who have more traditionally been there and are now nervous about saying that which they feel to be the case for fear of saying the inconvenient thing. And it's just allowing both those things to happen that makes for the richest conversations and the most in terms of dealing with these sort of polarities in a room. It makes for the richest conclusions that we can discover out of that.
I'm glad we're onto this topic. There's so many things we could do with what you've already said, but let's stick with the language thing, right? Or this notion that the very process of rehearsal is one of collaboration, in which you are pressing for certain forms of expression, right? This is an event hosted by the Center for Free Expression, right? So it just feels like we should run with this a bit, right? And then I'm assuming, of course, that then translates into what happens with the play, or the experimentation, the feeling, the way around how language is or is not serving each person who's going to be contributing to this collaborative art, right, will then assist in the project of bringing Shakespeare's language to the stage, right? And deciding what to do with it in the context of any given production. Othello, of course, is a play, I think, about language. It's about Iago's ability to use language to compel to force people to polls, right? To force them back into polarized positions, Othello especially, right? Because Othello is occupying a gray zone, and Iago resents it, right? For many reasons, right? Which will vary depending on what a director attempts to do with any given production. But yeah, I'm wondering if we can just think more about what it means.
Well, that's very interesting, because you say that Iago forces people into these polarities or compels them. What's interesting to me is that actually I think what he does is he persuades them to reveal things that already exist.
Yes.
And obviously that's what's uncomfortable about the play, is that he's not a monster in the sense that he creates these monsters. I mean, Othello has to take responsibility for his actions.
Yes.
Just as Cassio has to take responsibility, and Brabantio earlier, we all have to take responsibility for our actions. And as you say, the way Shakespeare has Iago, I mean, Iago is in some senses the best listener in the play. I mean, often he's not played like that. Often he's played as the showiest, the one that silences everyone else, the one that entertains all and us particularly, and plays the game and kind of authors the play. Now, for me, that's a profound misreading of the play. I think the opposite of the play is the case. He's a fantastic opportunist. I mean, it's not clear to me that he has the narrative of the play or the plot in his mind at the beginning. That there are genuine moments of jeopardy that shift the gears in his thinking and in the extremity of his action. I think that's very, very clear. But one needs to resist potentially the ego of performers who want to do the role to demonstrate muscle, because that is not what the play's about. So I think that's very important, and I think in engaging with Shakespeare's language, or any language, complex language, we have an opportunity to shatter some of the conventions that we have allowed to accrue around this work. I mean, the RP, middle class white voice that dominates the sound of this text in our ears, and unfortunately, I think it still does. I think we are being liberated, but how do we let in other traditions, other kinds of music into this another kind of euphony? We change the euphony of the words, we change the meaning of the words, which is incredibly important. So I mean, selfishly as a director, the greatest insights will come from those contributions from people who surprise you with their engagement with the language. But you have to find ways to empower them. And I've always been free to not be reverent with the language. I trust that people will come back to the language and enjoy it, and really enjoy it, once they have a freedom with it. So I allow all kinds of registers of performance in the rehearsal room when we're working on scenes. And is it okay if I share with you a little story about the drunk scene with Cassio?
Please.
Just to kind of demonstrate quickly how we did that in Othello in this instance. So in the drunk scene, Othello quickly imparts to us that he's he's going to make Cassio drunk. He's going to get Roderigo to incite him, and Cassio will basically shame himself because he can't hold his drink. And so everybody rushes in, and they have a great time, and they force Cassio to take a drink, get him more and more excited. Othello leads the party, and Roderigo at some point comes in and says something inappropriate, and Cassio loses it. And as a result of his action, subsequently having a fight with Montano, the leader of Cyprus, one of the generals in Cyprus, Othello just strips him of his post. So that's the arc in Shakespeare. Now, when we were rehearsing this scene, I had a chat with my Iago, Lucian, extraordinary actor, and he has a Tanzanian heritage. And I asked him, I said, do you have a song that your mother, or a song that you might have heard when you were growing up, that maybe represented the death, the ancients, your antecedents? And he said yes. His mother used to sing him a lullaby type song about his ancestors. Sorry, that was the word I was looking for. And I said, okay, I don't even need to know what it is. I'm not going to tell anybody else that this is what's going to happen. And so when we started the rehearsal, he had a boombox with a mic. And so everybody imagined there was going to be a certain kind of vibe to this party in this rehearsal room. And our actors rushed in, and they represented all different kinds of ethnicities. And they had musicians with them as well. So they were bringing the party into the room. And as they came in, Lucian started singing this song on the mic. And it was very sincere, very simple, and it broke him. Halfway through, he started to weep, and he continued weeping through the song. And what was interesting was watching this outside, I could see that the room started to polarize, that there were those maybe who had been othered in the world through their legacies or their histories, who might not have understood what he was singing about, but respected and felt the pain that he was singing. And there were others maybe who had more comfortable backgrounds and came from and belonged to a certain kind of had a certain ownership of the RSC and these rehearsal rooms, and that generally the white people who were made to feel either awkward or slightly irritated. And as it went on and on and on, they got more and more awkward and irritated. Now, the person who had status in that group was the actor playing Cassio, who happened to have a background that was public school, and he sounded like that, etc. And when Iago had finished, but basically when Lucian was unable to continue singing, he went up to him and he had a bottle of beer in his hand, and he overturned it on his head. And now, in that moment, the whole room was electrified, and I could feel the potential violence, the real violence.
Right.
Because nobody had talked about him doing this or them doing this, and they all looked to Lucian, the Iago, as to what he would do. And brilliantly, he chose to laugh, and he gave him the mic. And now, what nobody in the room knew was that the actor playing Cassio, and I knew this, also happened to be a fantastic beatboxer and rapper. And so he began the party by sort of aping Mr. Bombastic, Shaggy, and beatboxing brilliantly. And then and I allowed it to continue. And so we kind of navigated this potential violence, but the fracture was there. And then this rap battle began between the actor playing Montano and the actor playing Cassio, and they were both incredibly articulate, but they were both speaking their own. They had their own vocabularies of dissent, as it were, and it was, and I could see the actor playing Cassio was getting more and more annoyed as the actor playing Montano, the black actor, was getting more and more confident, and then he made a joke about how he was a white man on a black man's leash. And the actor playing Cassio lost it and went for him physically, not acting. They went for him. And I had to literally run into the room and separate them. calmed everyone down, reminded them where they were, and said, this is what we're doing, because this is the way our world is. To uncover these fractures, these fissures of on the surface, good people who would not recognize that kind of behavior, that sort of behavior would be possible. So yeah, that's an example of the ways that I try and invest in the people that I'm working with, a relationship to the language and the ideas and the contest of ideas, so that when it comes to coming back to the language, and it's very hard to say it better than Shakespeare says it, so I don't often need to paraphrase or to introduce or to remove vocabulary. That's a different kind of challenge, but once actors are empowered to really live in that language in the way that they want to, extraordinary things happen.
Wow. Yes, we could probably do more with what it means for the rehearsal process to be the occasion for, flushing certain things from out from under cover and dealing with these tensions, and then how that translates into what actually happens in terms of performance now as the play, like how that positions the company to maybe to do something different with the play than they might otherwise have done.
What it allows me to do is when they were having the rap battle, they were talking about things that are happening in the world now. The shootings in America were happening at the time, and they were referencing those things. So all the world as it is now comes into the room, and they lead my exploration. I learn from them how we move forwards, and how we try and articulate this play for an audience that's in the world now, a 21st century audience.
Yes, learning from them what it is that particular production really needs to address, right?
Exactly.
Okay. They're giving you the most pressing evidence, right, of what needs to be addressed by the play.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And of course, every Shakespeare play shifts. So I'm thinking of the production of the Tempest, right, and the ways in which just in the last 30 years it has served different purposes, right? Michael Billington sort of drew this to everybody's attention in his review for the RSC production of the Tempest in 2016, where he reminded us that Simon Russell Beale had played Ariel back in 1993, and at the in the climactic moment of the play, right, what he chose to do was spit, I think, right? The final gesture was to spit in Prospero's face, right? So that was a production, right, that was sort of playing up class problems, class aspects, right? Okay, and we're continually shifting. We're trying to figure out what social problems any given production needs to address. What would you most like to do next?
With the Tempest?
No, with any play. I mean, it might be.
With any. It's interesting you talk about the Tempest, because I played Prospero twice at different times when I was younger. I don't know how well I played it, but I've lived in the play, and it's interesting because obviously it also has different kinds of indigenous peoples and different kinds of definitions of what's indigenous, and Prospero has been banished, but he comes and basically lords it over one Caliban. But is he indigenous? No, Ariel is more indigenous than Caliban, and it's a very interesting exploration of power structures in the piece. It's also profoundly insightful about the way the presentation of the imagination, and for me, that's one of the things that Shakespeare does constantly. Is he makes as a generative metaphor, he makes the point that we can reimagine the world, that the world doesn't have to be as it is, that all structures are up for challenge and for dismantling, that we can break the rod and continue and find new ways to be. And I find the distillation of that in the Tempest is extraordinary. It's such a wise play, such a beautiful play. I mean, it's incredibly brave to have as the first, 30 odd minutes of the play, Prospero essentially telling Miranda a story, right? He tells, normally we we hide the exposition. Playwrights want to hide the exposition. They want to show rather than tell, is it that kind of thing. Whereas here, he seems to nakedly enjoy the fact that he is telling Miranda what happened before the play began. This is what happened, Miranda. And what's interesting about the way he does it is she's constantly trying to interrupt, and he silences her constantly throughout the whole thing. And then when Caliban's introduced, he silences him. And actually what you have is not just a portrait of somebody constructing their history,
Yes,
telling us, being the authority of his trauma. You also have enacted him oppressing others and silencing others and defining his narrative. Now, if there isn't a more beautiful, unsettling image of how histories work and how colonizing narratives work, I don't know of one. It's so elegantly done, and it generates so much else. So I mean, the Tempest, as you can see, is something that I would love to engage with as a director. King Lear is a play that I've always circled in my life. It's a terrifying, complex play, and it's the one on a primitive level unsettles me most, moves me most. I love its fracture. I find it. I don't find it nihilistic. There's enormous hard-earned compassion in that play, but it does dramatize cruelty in a way that I don't feel any other Shakespeare play does.
Thank you. Well, you've made me realize that the question I really should ask next is, how do you think the Shakespeare canon helps us deal with the problem of authoritarianism?
Yeah. Well, I think he's doing that in every single play, isn't he? There are always, almost always, oppressive authorities at the beginning, laws that require our protagonists to escape into the woods, to regender themselves. The world will not allow them to be that which they want to be. So I think that's incredibly interesting. And most of the comedies end with constrained happy endings, which again is fascinating and interesting and provocative, and the sort of hard truths that I think we need to be listening to and exploring ourselves. I think about, I mean, all of them. Romeo and Juliet, the most provocative thing about Romeo and Juliet is that there's a 13-year-old who falls in love with Romeo, who might be 15, 16, 17, I don't know. And then by the next day, they are married. And they are married by a friar, by an adult who wants to use their action to solve a political crisis. And out of that comes the tragedy. As I said, in Midsummer Night's Dream, there's a law that compels Hermia, because if she doesn't behave the way that her father wants her to behave, she will be put to death.
Right.
So she flees to the woods, etc., etc. And all these plays begin with these extraordinary provocations to us in terms of how we want to reflect on and make our worlds, make our contracts with each other in the audience and beyond that. But also he does it. Shakespeare, whoever I'm not really interested in who Shakespeare is. I'm just interested in the work. But those works do it in a way that also have love sown and compassion sown into them. He loves people. He loves. You feel he cares. I mean, so you talked about the very, very problematic plays like The Merchant of Venice, and yes, it's really difficult to see the depiction of a certain kind of cruelty that this Jew enacts on others, but also what he does is he shows massive cruelty visiting him, a massive tragedy visiting him, and ultimately, is he more compassionate for the Jew than he is for the Christian kingdom that forces him to renounce his religion completely unnecessarily, and has Portia do it, the person, the character who has won our sympathy most throughout the whole piece. I mean, Shakespeare seems to me to be very even-handed in the way that he deals with these things. He doesn't try and hide the difficulties or the cruelties, but he presents a very broad canvas of truths. And he has Shylock have the extraordinary speech, if you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh, etc. That extraordinarily compassionate insight about oppression and about what it is to be human. And I think that play is a much more profound expression of what it is to be human than Portia's speech on mercy. But because it's sown in trauma.
Yes.
And Shakespeare does that constantly throughout his canon.
Yes, well, Portia, of course, uses the power that she assumes through her masquerade, right? In order to, deal in just horrors with him, right? To drive him to the point. I mean, the ultimate point there is to, put him in a position that he has to declare himself content with what the court has done to him, right? So however we want to characterize what it is he wants out of the court, right? We need to see her brutality, right? So it does seem to me that we can maybe sometimes, with a given play, only get to a certain view of it, especially in production.
No, completely.
To the extent that a director is willing to confront all of the material that is put before us, right? And so with Portia, for example, right? I mean, I direct my own students' attention to her explicit racism, right?
Yeah.
And what I get always is resistance of some kind. And I'll never forget what one student said to me once, right? Confronting this class with the evidence, and one of them says, well, maybe she's a teensy weensy bit racist, right? And so our own engagement with the plays, right? We have our own blinkers and the many, many layers of interference, right? Ideological interference that keep us with grappling with the play. So for me, the most exciting thing, is to show up to see a production like Othello. I wish I could have seen that in person, right? And to have had the director do this incredibly thoughtful work, insisting on taking, every aspect of the play so seriously, so that so that we are made to confront things that are in the text that we might otherwise want to look past. And I think it's the moment we get to that kind of experience of a Shakespeare play that we can reach the sort of nuanced understandings, right? That then help us start to deal with polarization in our own.
Exactly. And Caroline, I mean, in an instance like that with Portia, it's not necessary to make the point about her racism to make her less likable, because that's the point of the play. Is that there will be people in the audience, and most of them will identify with her, will feel like they look like her in traditional performances, and they will like her. Yes. Shakespeare makes her extremely likable, and yet he sows in this contradiction, this complexity, and that's so much more effective to unsettle audiences in that way. Now the thing is, no, you can iron those things out because we want the audience to like her, or we can submit to the dramaturgy that Shakespeare has, which is to problematize our response, our emotional response, and our intellectual responsibility for that response. I think that's the point of it. I mean, and as you say, with the mercy thing at the end, the questions of justice at the end, when she says, why shouldn't he, as a representative of people who have suffered ages of trauma and oppression, be able to use the law to enact some kind of retribution? Why should he have to act exceptionally when the courts don't?
Yeah.
Now that's that's the amazing provocation that play presents in that moment. So I know it's this kind of play, and there are there are a number of plays where there are moments like this, and certainly around women and the way women are treated in the plays. There's many instances. I know it's uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
but I think those are necessary provocations, and I feel Shakespeare deals with them in a way that we can only benefit from. We might not enjoy it, but the conversations afterwards will only benefit us.
Right. Because we're being exercised in being able to hold contradictory views of any given character. I mean, the minute we can do that, right, we are moving ourselves out of polarization.
I mean, surely the most valuable observation is that people that disagree with us are also human beings. People who hold oppositional opinions to us, maybe people who voted for Trump, might also be admirable human beings in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they might be kind and all the rest of it, and we have to hold those two things within us. You have to. I mean, that's an extreme example, but and I've maybe lost the number of people out there now. But I think it's necessary for us to be able to listen properly to others, to have to kind of allow for them to be good human beings, even if they might hold views that might be objectionable to us. It's important to understand why good people might think bad things, or complicated things that we find complicated.
And to see the error play out, right? Yeah. So to be put in this state where we can both sympathize and feel our antipathy, and then see an error play out.
And our judgments about these things are provisional. You know, our moral systems shift constantly. You know, and the way we feel about Portia now might not be the way people felt about her then. Similarly, Shylock and many others, Rosalind, the outspoken Emilia in Othello, we have very different responses to her now than I imagine people might have had back in the day. You know, Taming the Shrew is a perfect example of, how do we respond to a play which appears to, I mean, now we watch it and we thrill to her disobedience, to Catherine's disobedience, and are horrified by her silencing at the end. That might not have been, I'm sure it wasn't the way original audiences, audiences that were mainly men, would have perhaps responded to her then. So these sort of shifting perspectives on the different perspectives dramatized in the piece is very interesting and rich. And I suppose the biggest truth is that truth is provisional. And our systems are provisional, and they remain healthy if we continue to contest them.
Well, I like what you were saying before, though, where the orientation is not to truth, any truth in quotation marks, but to emotion, right? To the impulses towards kindness and love, right? So that we could have this whole, we need to go to questions, but we could have this whole other sort of aspect of the conversation where we just think about what kind of emotions does a given Shakespeare play generate, and how that emotion, our affective experience of it, do something to us that then sends us back out into the world, hopefully, so that we are not going to indulge in the kind of emotion that creates polarities, that sees us using language, for example, as a weapon against others, or using language even, where it's not actively aggressive, but using language in such a way that we're catering to self-interest, rather than to some sort of larger communal interest, which has some urgency, and that needs.
I agree with that. It allows us to develop different registers of debate, so that when others are using language as a weapon against us, and maybe we have done that in the past, we might be able to find a more nuanced way of engaging with each other, and that starts with listening. That starts with not silencing the inconvenient response. It also means that you have to allow yourself to potentially be shifted by another's contributions, that you're not engaged constantly in shoring up your defenses against those that you know belong to a different tribe. That the one thing that you know, Jim just described all the various peoples that have come to make up Canada, that have a legacy there. And you kind of go, well, isn't that a beautiful thing? I mean, the whole idea of going back to some kind of antecedent pure greatness is on the one hand ridiculous. It doesn't exist. We're all mongrels and immigrants. But also for me, that mongrelness, the messiness, is the thing that gives us our greatest richness of utterance and thought and imagination. And I think Shakespeare's plays are that in print. They are messy, bitty, gappy things. They are the plays we have on our shelves are unstable creations, but they're more extraordinary for that, I think.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, we must have questions coming at you from the audience. Ange, do you have a question?
Yeah, first I just want to remind people that they can use the Q&A button at the bottom of their screen if they have questions. So the first one is, do you think that the play Othello and the character himself reflects or defines what it's like being a Black man in white America?
I can't speak to that authoritatively, as I'm not a Black man in white America. My sense is, though, that the play can be used to tell those sorts of stories. I mean, my comments on that would center around the fact that this is a man who, when he plays the game, is valorized. And he's valorized for a certain time. So when he wins the war for Venice against the Turks, by the next message, he's being displaced by Cassio, his white inferior, who has no experience. That seems to me to be the story of Black men in white America, Black men in Britain, people of color all around the world, which have been dominated by colonial powers. That's a truth. The peculiar kind of unstable psychosis that he seems to have around the betrayal of Desdemona is, I think, interesting, and I think it's open for debate. And I won't talk about this authoritatively. I'll just give you my view. And my view is that for someone who has spent his whole life not trusting, constructing a contract with powers, but being in control of that game, to commit to someone as he does at the beginning. And as he says, excellent wretch, perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee. And when I love thee not, chaos is come again. He dramatizes in that utterance how fragile his psyche is. So when he begins to doubt her, I think his mind fractures, because all the fissures that have been constructed out of his relationship to that oppressive world are suddenly exposed. And I think that those sort of mental health issues with people of color, Black people in white America, wherever, seem to me to be very persuasively telling a story about the present condition. Thank you.
Thank you. Ange, do you have another question for us?
Yeah, I do have another one. The next one is from Julia, and she says, your Desdemona is very innovative. She's so cheeky and so bold. What was your thinking there?
That's a great question. Thank you. Well, I mean, I suppose I was taking my lead from Shakespeare. I mean, again, in reading the play, again, I just, what I was so surprised by was her, because again, in performance history, she's the emblem of innocence. a kind of naive and of a naivety, an innocence that is then, you know, it's an uncomplicated, minimal interiority symbol of goodness. And I'm not sure that's what Shakespeare writes, because at the beginning, she comes onto the stage, she has already eloped with Othello. She knew that, they had planned that beforehand. They discovered, and the time frame suddenly shifts because Othello's being called away that night. She stands up in front of the court. Nobody asks her to. Well, they ask her whether this man, you know, forced her to take her, and she stands up both to the court, to the Duke, and to her father. And then, when Othello is asked to ship away that night, that moment, she says that she wants to go with him to a war zone, to the most dangerous place. I mean, even Othello, when he responds initially with I'll not have it so, she interrupts the proceedings with, nor I. And then she makes the case, and Othello has to submit to her. Now, I think he would know that is a very dangerous place to be taking her. And yet she has the confidence to do that. And when they're there in Cyprus, the wonderful thing is her boldness, is her wit, is her strength that makes her so persuasive. I mean, as an object that might betray him, she is an independent soul, and so it was very important for me to show her dancing with Othello when she got to Cyprus, to just show that he celebrated that before his faith was rocked. It was important to see them in a context where he was unproblematically embracing her strength, her physical embodied strength. And then obviously, once the doubts creep in, all of those things become the poison for him as it moves on. So yeah, no, it's very important. And just finally, just briefly, it was also important for me in constructing her, in sort of working with the actor to construct a story for her, that again, taking the lead from the play, there is a performance history suggests that Emilia and Desdemona have some kind of sisterhood, and that ultimately they just need to find each other in that final scene. Now, that doesn't exist in the play. There is no antecedent relationship between Emilia and Desdemona. Emilia's loyalty is to her husband. She comes from a completely different part in a class. Desdemona's closest relationship is with the person that comes from her class, Cassio. And so to tell a story about her own entitlement, a difficult story, it's not very, she's not shown in the best light, but to find that moment where the two women, as it were, begin to see each other, they become visible to each other. And that, again, that compassion is hard earned, but I think that's where the dramaturgy of the play is leading us. Yeah, so I know I really enjoyed exploring that and discovering that with the wonderful actress who played her. And I was unafraid to cast her young. I know there was some comment about, well, you know, he's very old and she seems very, very young, as if that is not what the play is dramatizing and I was being in some way perverse. That's the play.
True enough. While we're waiting for the next question, you know, let me just quickly note what's extraordinary about that actress's performance are the small moments where we see the confidence tipping over into a sense of superiority with Emilia, right?
Absolutely.
Which seemed to me particularly charged, given that you had cast a person of color as Emilia, right? Yeah. So that we had both class and race in play, and just those you know, like quick moments, right, where the text is actually requiring Desdemona to, in effect, issue, you know, a statement of command, but the delivery just, you know, slightly heightening that, so that we ourselves are put in that sort of terrible predicament where we absolutely want to celebrate the confidence of this character and the confidence of that actress's performance of the character, right? All of its incredible sensuality and so on. And yet, precisely because Shakespeare's text endlessly complicates things for us, We have those moments where we have to see, we have to be reminded that Desdemona's own background is one of privilege.
That's
And
right.
so
That's right.
there will be, right, these choices.
It's the most frustrating thing. Exactly. It's the most frustrating thing in watching productions of Othello, watching Desdemona not listen to Emilia, make constant good sense, and she constantly bats it off, ignores it. She can't hear it, and I think it makes us think that, you know, that Desdemona is inexperienced, innocent, etc. Whereas actually, I think what's much more persuasive is that her privilege doesn't allow her to see or hear this character in the way that she deserves. She constantly interrupts her and diminishes her contributions. That tells a story about the different classes and about different kinds of privilege, exactly as you say, Caroline.
Yeah. Ange, do you have another question for us?
I do, yeah. The next one is from Jyotsna. I always love how you stress the provisionality of human experience as we see it in Shakespeare and the provisionality of emotions. But we live in a world where emotions are entrenched in divisiveness. How can Shakespeare teach us to be provisional?
I think I know Jyotsna, Professor Jyotsna. How can he teach us to be? Well, I think because he is. I think. I mean, it's when creatives get a hold of his work, and I'm thinking here about the performance history, and they sort of do three-dimensional essays, and they edit the plays and they edit the experience of these plays to represent a certain argument, and they limit or they suggest, they concretize a truth or an argument through the play, and it can be very impressive. But for me, that's not what's exciting about these plays. The plays are messy and contradictory, I think, on purpose. I think we're constantly entering into scenes where the characters, the language, the movement of the action suggests it's going somewhere, and then it constantly surprises and shifts. So the perfect example of this is in Much Ado About Nothing. The scene where the main plot, where hero and Claudio are about to get married, and obviously he feels that she's betraying him, and he chooses that moment to humiliate her in front of everyone, and then he leaves having shamed her. And then her father disowns her, almost threatens to kill her, turn her out onto the street, is calmed by the priest, and they concoct this plot to perform her death rites, to let it be known that she is dead, and see what the truth of the situation might or might not be, and that if she's proved to be false, then we'll stow her away in a nunnery. Otherwise, everyone will say sorry. This extraordinary, but the scene doesn't end there. It then continues with Beatrice and Benedict, the subplot. These two people who have always been vying in love, as it were. Are they? Aren't they? They love to hate each other, as it were. And it's at that moment that the two of them tell each other that they love each other for the first time. And the way Benedict says it is, I love nothing in the world so much as you. Is not that strange? I mean, everything dances around uncertainty. It's so delicate, it's so fragile. Everything, the whole scene, the way the whole scene moves, it's so provisional. We can't hold on to anything. We live in provisional worlds, and characters are constantly evolving and developing. They're not types. Yeah, I mean, to be in those works, to create out of them, is to create out of provisionality and instability, and to experience those plays done in the ways that I think they should be done, is to be confronted by the full range of contradictory things that make us human most fully. Thanks, Joyce.
Yeah. And, you know, Shakespeare plays with it, you know. I love Touchstone's speech and As You Like It, right? To his response to Corin's question, and how to like you this shepherd's life, Master Touchstone. And we have to hear the wildly polarized positions, right? Truly separate in respect of itself, it is a good life, but in respect that it is a shepherd's life, it is not. In respect that it is solitary, I like it very well, but in respect that it's private, it is a very vile life. No, in respect that in the fields, it pleases me well, in respect is not the court, it is tedious, right? So there's you know, polar views, binary positions played up for us, right, as a matter of comedy, right? Just a moment, right? A moment of play. And I was so glad to hear you go to one of the comedies, right? Because we focused on the
right?
And, you know, and the comedies do different things.
Well, and it's throughout the plays. And I mean, the greatest minds in the plays, as it were, can't make up their minds. You know, Hamlet. You know, they and that's not an index of a lack of intelligence. For me, that's an index of real sharp questioning. That's kind of what it is to be human.
Yes,
is that you have provisional positions. Even Othello, after I'll chop her all to messes, is reverting back to she'll sing the wildness out of a bear, or whatever that line is. You know how sweet it's minds that are great minds that are genuinely engaged in trying to make sense of their lives and trying to define what action they should take, have to negotiate the provisionality of their assessments at any one moment, and that for me is the most profoundly useful thing to have dramatized and take away.
Yes, wonderful. Right. Ange, have you got another question for us?
I do have a couple more left. The next one is from Nicholas, and Nicholas asks, what questions or reflections do you hope to put to the audience in your productions of The Merchant of Venice?
Right. Well, so a couple of things there. Firstly, I'm a director who serves playwrights. So what I'm trying to do, and I do mean this, I'm not just being insincere here. I try and serve the visions of others, and often I'm engaged with great playwrights, great artists who have important things to say. So, and if I think those things are very important, then I'm trying as best I can to serve those truths, those often complicated, complex truths. But obviously, beyond that, I am making choices at every single point. Whatever great ideas they are in the room, and whoever they might have come from, I have to ultimately select the idea that we run with. So in that sense, I am authoring or framing a certain experience for an audience, and I suppose the sorts of things that that guide me are that those experiences. I'm unafraid for audiences to confront difficult experience. Sometimes I think it's very important for us to experience uncomfortable and ugly things, but only to the extent that the experience allows for the fact for us to understand the roots of that ugliness, the fact that there is a potential to be another way, or to understand the actions of someone that might be awful, to understand the context of those actions, to understand how someone might be disfigured by the uglier society that they live in. So I suppose getting audiences to consider the responsibility for things. I mean, as an audience, we come into a room, it's dimmed, and in the Shakespeare play, since we're talking about that now, we could at any point intervene. And if it's done properly, they're talking to us and asking us questions and asking for intervention, and we don't. So therefore, we are complicit in whatever is going on, enormously complicit. And what I want the audience to feel when they leave is what is the nature of what they allowed to happen? What is the nature of their responsibility for those sorts of things in life, in their own lives, to reflect on? If I can shift their thinking a little bit, if I can shift their paradigm. There was a brilliant expression somebody used when you were, if I can puncture their ideological bubbles, then I think I've done something good. I'm not interested necessarily in toppling icons, but I am in shaking them. You know, it's that kind of thing that I'm very interested in doing. I'm very happy to serve someone who wants to topple icons, though. I mean, that I have no problem with that at all. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Othello is, of course, a play, I think, about complicity, about really small moments, right?
Yeah.
Make the minor characters complicitous unwittingly, right? In Iago's plot, right? And so, yeah, it's a wonderful play for, I think, getting us to recognize, right, those traps, those daily traps that we could fall into, right?
Yeah.
Those small choices you might make that have large consequences potentially for others. Others you may never know somehow because you start some sort of terrible ripple effect, right?
Are you thinking about the handkerchief there in particular?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, for example, Bianca racing in with the handkerchief, right? In a moment that Iago can't possibly have predicted, right? Right? To stand up for herself, right? That's what she's doing in that moment, right? You've given me this minx's token, and why do I have to take the workout? You know what? Now that I had a few minutes to think about it, I'm not going to do it, and you can have the damn thing back, right? And so we have that contradiction, right, of the woman who is standing up for herself, inadvertently providing evidence to Othello, right? Someone that she doesn't even know is present,
Absolutely brilliant.
in a place to observe, right? And thinks now, there it is. There it is.
And then it's confronted by the other woman later, by Emilia, and shamed by her publicly.
Yes, right. And so, yeah, well, where has Emilia made a small choice that in that moment, I mean, she makes a big choice in regard to the handkerchief, of course. Agreeing to steal it for Iago, but I was just trying to sort of echo your point, right? That if we can have an understanding of complicity because of our experience of the drama, yes, we're positioned to walk out the theater doors, maybe a little bit better positioned to take responsibility for those intricate acts that we're all involved in every day of our lives. In our complex network of social relations, right? We are not ourselves the inadvertent source of some kind of wrong or violence, right? So maybe that's another way of thinking about Jocelyn's question, so that we're compelled to maybe not to be provisional, but maybe to just maybe a little bit calmer, or take our choices a little bit more carefully, or whatever, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And have you got another question for us?
I do. I have a question from an attendee, and they ask, as we re-examine courses in theater education, does Shakespeare still have a place?
I'm sure you can speak to that as well, Carolyn.
Well, I'm biased.
Do you want to start on that? Shall I start, and then I'm sure you'll jump in. I think it absolutely does. I think it needs to be challenged. I think the way we engage with it in education needs to be challenged. I think it's way too complacent. One of the things that I think it's important for us to do when because actually what we're talking about here surely is the first encounters with this work. How are those mediated? How are they managed? And those are fantastic opportunities in education to start from a different center than that which has existed up to now. And I would say taking away for a second all the sort of historical and political, the nexus that surrounds these works, I would begin in performance. I would begin in, I've done opera workshops, I've done Shakespeare workshops with very, very young kids. And what's extraordinary is these elitist, complicated works speak directly to young people. Their musicality, their physicality thrills them always. They feel before they think. That electric current is there if it's not mediated. So I would say the role of performers and theatre companies and companies like Box Clever, the one that I work for, where we go into schools and we will rehearse in schools. We will have children in our rehearsal room with us, talking about stuff. They will affect the choices that we make. And they get to see us, they get to see it change constantly. They get to see how what they have said has shifted everything. They get to see the actors fail. They get to see the actors being inarticulate, and then discovering an articulacy. And I mean, all of these things, I think, are the stuff that makes theatre, but particularly Shakespeare, particularly exciting. We can then get to the ideas that he dramatizes, and and again, even there, I think it's best to start with the dramaturgy of Shakespeare, rather than starting with the language. It's to kind of go, well, as I was saying earlier on, if you break these plays down to their simplest form, and often we do this with Box Clever, we do shortened versions that lock into certain ideas, but with Romeo and Juliet, it's this idea of this timeline. 13-year-old, is it a love play? Are they in love at the beginning? Are they the greatest lovers, or is it an obsession? They get married, they meet on Sunday evening, they get married on Monday morning, and he's killed her cousin in the afternoon. Then he's gone to her, and then he's been banished, and they consummate their relationship in the evening, and then he leaves. That's extraordinary. When does it become love? Just setting that thing up in that way makes everyone speak about their experience of what it is to be young. Is it love? Is it love for them inside them? As a 13-year-old, is it the universe in miniature? Etc., etc. So what responsibility do the older people have in Romeo and Juliet to the tragedy of these young people? And setting up these provocative questions, Merchant of Venice, is it about anti-Semitism, or is it about hate speech, full stop? Can we open this out? Is anti-Semitism as old as the Holocaust, or does it go back, 1,000 years before? Etc. There are ways of opening out these experiences, as I said in Midsummer Night's Dream, to kind of have a law that says this young girl can't marry the person that she loves. She has to obey her father, and if she doesn't, the law means that she will be killed. And this is at a time where the leader has just abducted his wife and is marrying her, and this is part of some kind of weird celebration of that situation. That's an extraordinary setup. And if we can engage young people with these questions, and for me, Shakespeare deals with them brilliantly, but we need to in exploring the ideas and the resonances of the ideas, I think we need to let other voices in that haven't traditionally been let into those conversations. And we need to let the music of different kinds of people into the room. I'm talking really simply accents. The music of the language is incredibly important. And if somebody's in control of their instrument, then it's jazz. If they're playing an instrument that they're not used to, and they're making a sound that is unfamiliar to them, it's constrained. It's a dead thing. It's a compelled thing. It's a colonized thing. These things will live much more freely and importantly for people if you allow them to take ownership of it. If you enable them to take ownership of it, and then they will discover their truths. I think those are the ways into this material, and I think it's incredibly important. I wouldn't banish it from the curriculum.
Right. And it was the theater education curriculum, right, that was at stake here, right? So I do think that's not where I teach, right, of course, because I teach in an English department.
Right.
But I assume that one of the difficulties with Shakespeare and theater education is the interference, all of the static that comes in with the reverence.
Yeah.
Right. And the intimidation factor,
Yeah.
right? And then everything Madeline Sayette is worried about, right? What does it mean for it to be that writer, and maybe that writer's material to be handled in a certain way that would not make possible, Iqbal, what you've just said is essential, right? Really letting music of different accents into the room and so on, so that it is somehow material that belongs equally to everyone who's participating in the process, without this, this oppressive sort of sense, right? That there are certain kind of responses that are privileged, certain ways of working with it are privileged, and so on.
Well, I mean, and the most exciting thing about Shakespeare's work is that he's constantly enjoying the challenge to authorities. And as we're moving through education, the most perfect educators should try and inspire, and I mean that in its old sense, to flame the disobedience of their students, to give them agency, to challenge, to be critical of their experience. And I think Shakespeare's a fantastic vehicle for that, potentially.
No question. And this is why, of course, right-wing governments are doing what they can to get literature, to displace literature, including Shakespeare, right? To make sure there simply isn't enough money to fund certain programs, right? Because of the political threat constituted by it. All right, so I see that we're almost out of time, but do we have time to squeeze in one more question? I don't know, Ange, do we?
No, there's,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, Iqbal, may I ask you a question? And the question is this. What question do you wish I had asked today?
Oh, that's always
I really should have, in order to make sure we got.
Oh no, listen, I think you've asked the questions you wanted to ask, and those are the questions you should have asked me.
Are you sure? All right. Maybe so. We've got 3 minutes. Well, why don't we use them?
Okay.
Why don't we use them? Maybe just for final reflections on, where you might go next. I know you, so you have some interest, right, in possibly directing Lear, right?
Yeah, no, I would love to. I mean, there are many plays that I would like to do. I think the biggest thing for me with these plays, in terms of where I'm at the moment, is to try and do versions of them where the people who are making them represent as broad a sphere of experience as possible. I mean, I've done versions of the plays where it's an Asian-only company, and and that's a valuable, really important thing to do, to give people opportunities to refresh and reframe these plays. But I really enjoyed the experience of having a Simon Russell Beale in a room with a David Ajao, the young black actor from Peckham, and to find ways of having them use their experiences and to challenge their authorities over the material, and people like a Simon Russell Beale welcome those challenges if they feel safe. And people like David Ajao would learn loads from Simon Russell Beale and teach him loads about how this material can work now. So those intersections of people that go to making this work for the world now, I think is the space that I would most like to be. It's not the only place I'd like to be. That's the great joy of being a director, is you can move into different sort of spheres and genres. But in terms of Shakespeare, that is the most exciting place for me to be, I think.
That's wonderful. So it begins always with the company, right? And yes, and as you say, making sure that company is as diverse as possible. And that's the starting point, right?
It's the world in miniature, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Well, let me tell you, I cannot wait to see whatever you decide to do next. And I wish you the best of luck with whatever Shakespeare you decide to grapple with next.
Thank you so much.
I guess I now have to toss it back to Jim.
Well, I just want to thank the two of you. A lot of us are having to spend a lot of our lives on Zoom. And usually when I'm on a Zoom event, after 45 minutes or 50 minutes, I start getting bored and wonder whether the time is. And I've just been mesmerized by your conversation. It's been exciting. I wish it weren't coming to an end now. So I really want to thank both of you for sharing your thoughts and experiences and wisdom with us. It's remarkable, and certainly has left me with lots to think about afterwards. I'm very grateful
Thank you,
to
Jim.
both of you.
Thank you for making it possible, Jim.
I'd like to remind the audience that today's conversation is one in a whole series that the Center for Free Expression is doing. And our next event, which will be next week on Tuesday, November 3rd, is on anti-Black racism and the theater. And the conversation is with Philip Aiken, who's an award-winning actor and director, and was a founder and artistic director for 14 years of the Obsidian Theater Company, which it describes itself as passionately dedicated to the exploration, development, and production of the Black voice. It's going to be a wonderful conversation. His interlocutor is going to be Luke Reese, who is also an actor and director and producer. He had been in Obsidian and elsewhere. And so I look forward to that conversation where we really try to interrogate the sense of anti-Black racism in the theater, and welcome you to join us. So it'll be next Tuesday, November 3rd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And the information on this and the other programs are on the Center for Free Expression website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. I look forward to seeing many of you again, and thank you so much for coming today. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.